All right.
Yours.
Yes.
Ready. All right, ready? Okay, I will call this meeting to order of the MVTC WMATA Committee. Welcome, my name is Walter Alcorn. I'm the chair of this committee, and this is the October 20 meeting of the MVTC WMATA Committee. And I'd like to note that the meeting is starting at 6:04 p.m., which in my book is just about on time.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
This meeting is being live streamed to allow our listening audience to be able to watch through YouTube Live. And tonight we have one committee member who may be participating voluntarily. It's not yet called in. Mr. DeFerenti is participating or will be participating virtually from Arlington for a personal reason due to a scheduling conflict. So at this point, I'll ask staff if we have quorum.
We do.
Okay, then let's go ahead and get started. The first item on the agenda is the September 29th MVTC WMATA committee meeting summary. So do any committee members have any changes to that summary? Okay, seeing and hearing none, we'll consider that approved. So let's just jump into the next item. This is not something on the agenda, but Mr. Letourneau, do you have an update for the commission on any WMATA matters?
Yes. There is obviously Wednesday morning, everybody's familiar with the announcement that good news that Silverline work is complete, that operational readiness is ready to be declared. The bad news is we're awaiting safety certification on the Silverline itself, which is not bad news. That's a normal part of the process, and that I think is on track. But that we also don't have enough trains to run service to Silverline. Can you?
Yeah, you want
Why don't we go back in a second? There's some late breaking.
All right, we'll come back to Letourneau's report. So let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and start the part, the next item on the agenda, which is the 2022 update on the annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA. So this is required by state code. MVTC is responsible for the annual submission to the governor and the General Assembly of a report on the performance and conditions of WMATA. And this is going to be the 5th annual report produced by MVTC, and a draft of the introduction, strategies, and dedicated capital funding chapters is in the meeting materials. So let's have a very brief presentation. I know we've talked about this a couple of times before, but it's always good to go over it again and make sure it's complete and accurate to the committee's wishes. So go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you. Go to slide 4, please. Thank you. So as we've discussed, the structure of the report is similar to prior years, but I do want to highlight how we've incorporated committee feedback over the last few meetings, as we have drafted what is in your packet before you. With the audience, the governor and General Assembly, we've created an introduction here that gives a framework about WMATA's short and long-term operating funding gaps, focusing on WMATA's gradual recovery from the pandemic and laying out the structural challenges that face the operating budget. Based on comments in the last meeting, we've laid out that the current available paths are unsustainable, either managing $700 to $900 million operating budget gap through service cuts, or expecting our jurisdictions who have limited fiscal tools available to solve this through traditional additional subsidies. And so as such, that we need an operating and revenue model. Should the timing be right for the report, we will make sure to include additional content on the opening of new stations, like the Silverline Phase 2, feature that content. Next slide, please. This is an overview of the strategies. We gave a lot of detail on them at the last meeting. And discussed, the strategies chapter is intended to meet that legislative requirement of strategies, recommending strategies to reduce the cost and efficiency, but also a way for us to highlight and meet we've streamlined the chapter to show these 7 recommendations for the year, and again to show our priorities. As we've worked on the report, we've chosen to embed recent accomplishments into the relevant chapters. This slide includes both strategies for WMATA and those for NVTC, and just to highlight the strategies for NVTC, patients of local transit agencies, studies, white paper that we would propose for next year. And the second is to examine and develop options for a financial operating model for WMATA, and through the proposed WMATA operating funding and reform working group concept. And we have a full draft of the introduction strategies and the expenditures of the dedicated capital fund in your packet. We're still waiting on additional data from the NCD to finish up the report, but we're working on putting it together. Steps would be to have this as an information item at the November commission meeting. So,
Okay, so yes, questions, Mr. Meyer, please.
On the recommendations and funding for Core WMATA and the funding partners, the 5 that are listed there, they're not necessarily in priority order.
I don't think so. I think the order that they're in was generated more about going from increasing revenues to controlling expenses. I think it was intentional to put rebuild customer confidence and restoring the 7th. But beyond that, I wouldn't say there's a this is number 1 exactly ordered through 5. Okay.
And even to add, just 4 and 5 are ones that we've had in each report. So in some ways, the newer focus are the higher numbers. But we definitely encourage folks to dive in and read the write-ups and the chapters of this. It's hard just to see a bullet, all that's involved in these things.
Suggestions, Mr. Meyer?
Well, I mean, we could talk about this all evening, and we won't. I promise. But and I'm not. These are all challenging recommendations. They're very different, and rebuilding customer confidence is critical, of course. How do you evaluate that? Is it something you can put metrics against? Hard, other than ridership numbers themselves, or a reduction in crime incidences or on-time service. Those are some things you could put against that. Managing labor costs is very easy to monetize that, and but much more difficult to do in some ways. But they're not they're not dependent. Well, all of these are dependent variables in a way. I don't want to subconsciously list these recommendations in this order necessarily as our priorities. I think they're all probably in some ways equal to each other, but some are more long-term, some are more expensive, some are more tenacious in achieving. So I'll just an observation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Meyer. I would note, just in terms of process, this will be the last opportunity, unless the schedule changes, for this committee to talk about this. We are going to be getting the draft only via, I guess, email, and that will be discussed at the full commission meeting. So,
And Mr. Chairman, by asking the question, I am not suggesting that we reorder this. Okay.
good point. These are very different. Okay. Okay. Other questions, comments from committee members?
If I might, Mr. Chair, I think in part response to Mayor Meyer's concerns that when you look at the launch, actually breaks down WMATA should rebuild customer confidence into a number of discrete subsections. So it's more sort of manageable than it might first appear, just looking at the title. So maybe that's something we could look at to whether that is responsive or not.
Thank you, Mr. Any other comments, suggestions on the report? Okay, well, thank you very much. Staff, Andrew, do you have what you need, you think?
Oh, yes.
Okay, very good. Then let's move on to item 4, which is an update on MVTC research. This is WMATA peer transit operating funding. This was it was attached, but we really are looking for more information on peer transit agencies and how they're funded. So we did earlier this year, we did receive as a committee pressure on how WMATA, and through the annual report update process, expressed the need for a new operating funding model. Part of those discussions, we had asked as a committee if staff could research how peer transit agencies to WMATA fund their operating expenses. So tonight, NVTC staff are bringing the results of their research to the committee. Oh, and Mr. DiFerenti is joined us. Hello, Mr. DiFerenti, welcome.
Hi, thanks. Sorry to be a little late.
Perfect, thank you. So as Mr. Alcorn mentioned, this request is a direct follow-up to, this presentation is a direct follow-up to our transit fellow, Jonathan Bonilla, advanced his research with us, which is what enabled us to have the capacity to bring it to you now. We looked at peer transit agencies' operating budgets to see what kinds of revenues they use. These agencies included BART, CTA, LA Metro, MARTA, MBTA, and New York MTA. We also looked at peers in the government sense. While these agencies are smaller than WMATA, they are governed by interstate compacts. That includes ATCO, CAP, and St. Louis Metro. We looked at the most recent budgets available, 22, which of course was an unusual year given COVID, and all agencies at the time had some level of federal aid. All agencies listed have some form of rail, some heavy, some light, and as you can see on the table on the right, many agencies run a great number of different modes. Next slide, please. Before we get to other agencies, I'd like to give a very brief refresher into how WMATA is funded. WMATA's operating funding mainly comes through passenger fares, non-fare revenues like advertising, real estate, and jurisdictional operating subsidies, which for this presentation are referred to as state and local funding. In the last few fiscal years, of course, federal COVID aid has been a large part of that budget. In the WMATA context, each funding jurisdiction annually appropriates funds to pay its operating subsidy. And this also includes revenue sources which may be specifically designated for that use, which is a little different than dedicated funding, but something I'll talk about more on the next slide. Next slide, please. So WMATA does not have any dedicated operating revenues, not to jump to the findings just yet. What those are typically taxes that flow directly to and are managed by a transit agency. However, some funding jurisdictions in our area do have revenue sources that are specifically designated for so, in Virginia, our local governments meet their obligations to Metro using a mixture of general fund revenues, their MBTA 30% funds, and or other transportation funds, depending on the city or the county. Our local governments also instruct NVTC to make payments on their behalf from their respective regional gas tax and state aid trust fund accounts, and those funding sources are largely designated for use in their Metro subsidies. In Maryland, the state, not the two counties, is the responsible funding jurisdiction, and they meet their obligation from the statewide transportation trust fund, which is supported by a variety of. The district meets authority of its operating subsidy from its general funds. There are, however, two revenue sources specifically designated to pay their metro subsidies, parking meter revenues, and taxes. Revenues generated from private operators of parking lots and garages. At this point, I will hand it to Renetta, who will cover peer agencies in greater detail, and she is also joining us on.
Welcome, Rich.
Thanks, Andrew. As Andrew mentioned, we looked at the operating budget for peer agencies and we focused on fiscal year 22. We can see that during that year, all of the agencies did receive federal COVID aid. In this comparison, we excluded LA Metro as well as MTA, just because their operating budget was extremely higher than the agencies we have listed here. So when we looked at their budget, we categorized the different line items based on the following categories. So we looked at dedicated funding, state and local revenue, fair revenue, non-fair revenue, as well as COVID aid. So I'm just going to provide kind of like a brief description on each of the agencies. So as Andrew mentioned earlier, WMATA operate whatever passenger and other revenues don't cover in the operating budget is the responsibility of the three jurisdictions. And as we can see, WMATA doesn't currently have a dedicated funding for operating. Moving along to BART. So BART actually has a sales tax in the 3 BART county districts. So San Francisco, Contra Costa County, and Alameda County. And so 75% of that sales tax goes towards the dedicated funding. And they also have a legacy property tax, which was created concurrently as the agency was planning and development of the agency. And looking at the state side, they also have some emission related revenues that the state provides to them as well. Next, in looking at CTA, they have a dedicated sales tax that is imposed on the 6 counties who are part of the RTA, or the Regional Transportation Authority. And this tax is collected by the state. The sales tax rate is different between the city of Chicago and Cook counties and the outer counties. And the city of Chicago also has a real estate transfer tax, which is matched by a certain percentage by the legislature, who may also add additional non-statutory funds. Next is MARTA. So MARTA has a sales tax that was created from the MARTA Act and the Rapid Transit Contract and Assistant Agreement, and it was an agreement for dedicated revenue for transit. So there is a sales tax in the city of Atlanta, as well as the surrounding counties, Fulton, DeKalb, and Clayton County. And they also have an ad valorem tax on vehicle titles. And then next is MBTA. So they have 16% of they have a sales tax, a statewide sales tax, and 16% of that revenue goes to their dedicated funding stream. In terms of their state and local funding, they have what they refer to as a local assessment, which would be compared to jurisdictional subsidies in the WMATA space. And these local assessments cannot have an annual increase of more than 2.5%. And then lastly, looking at St. Louis Metro, they also have a sales tax that varies between the city and the county, as well as St. Clair County in Illinois. This is also one of the agencies that has an interstate compact between Missouri and Illinois as well. And then one other thing to mention on this slide in relation to state and local funding is that when we looked at all of these agencies, the majority of the funding from the state and local bucket came from the localities. Next slide, please. So this slide, we just wanted to showcase another way to look at the data. So we pretty much just look at each of the revenue sources based on percentages. So you can just see all of the different agencies and each percentage of each of the categories that we looked at. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we wanted to show which agencies utilize the different funding sources. So just from an initial glance, you can see that MTA has a variety of different taxes. And all of the agencies we looked at besides PATH and PATCO have a sales tax that vary in form and amount. And aside from BART, all the remaining agencies have a sales tax that is slightly higher in the major city as compared to the surrounding counties. And also, as mentioned earlier, BART has a legacy property tax that was created in conjunction with the planning of the agency. And both CTA and MARTA have a real estate transfer tax. So I'm just going to explain, go into a little more detail about the remaining taxes listed up here. So MARTA has a title ad valorem tax, and it's a one-time tax that's paid at the time that a vehicle is titled. This tax is collected in all of the counties in Georgia where vehicles are titled, and then it's processed in the 3 MARTA counties. The next tax, or the remaining taxes, really will be referring to MTA. So the first one is the payroll mobility tax. This is also known as the Metropolitan Commuter Transportation Mobility Tax, and it's pretty much just a payroll expense for employers, and the tax rate is basically determined on the expense. They also have a petroleum business tax, and this tax is comprised of 3 other taxes. So the first is a business privilege tax, and this tax is imposed on petroleum businesses that operate in New York State. They also have a gas and diesel fuel excise tax, which involves all motor fuel and diesel imports into the state for use, distribution, storage, or sale. They also have a vehicle registration and driver's license tax on individuals who reside inside the Metropolitan Commuter Transportation District. The MTA also has a mortgage recording tax, and this tax is imposed on both borrowers and lenders in New York City, as well as the 7 other counties within the MTA service area. And lastly, they have corporate franchise tax. This is a statewide tax imposed on transportation and transmission companies, and 80% of the revenue from this tax goes towards their operating revenues. Next slide, please.
All right. Thank you, Renetta. So as we compiled this research, we found that essentially all peer transit agencies to WMATA had some form of dedicated operating revenues for transit operations. Of the smaller agencies who were interstate compacts, St. Louis did have a sales tax in both states. PATCO and PATH were just unique and candidly have very difficult budgets to decipher. They're part of larger Port Authority operations where bridge and tunnel tolls are a big part of that, so it's just really not too comparable. The second key finding is that the most common form of dedicated operating revenue was the sales tax, which often went to capital and/or operating. The most significant use of the sales tax we found was LA Metro, where there are 4 separate sales tax measures or propositions that directed a variety of percentages of those taxes to all sorts of different buckets: capital, operating, expansion, you name it. The geography that we found is that cities and counties in each transit agency having sales taxes was really diverse, including rate. Sometimes it'd be a variable rate in different parts of the region. Often central cities and counties had a higher rate, while outer jurisdictions had a lower amount. In some cases, sales tax revenues were direct to the agency. In other cases, they went to some form of state charter body of that agency, and then those revenues were redistributed to other transit agencies as well. Chicago is a good example there. And sometimes that was formula, and sometimes that was discretion. So really examples across the board. The other key finding is that the larger the agency, the more sources it had. The most notable there is MTA, which if we had put it on the figures would have blown up the y-axis to a point to make the figure illegible because they're so large. They had a long list of revenue sources. And lastly, no one we looked at has WMATA's unique governance and funding structure. No one is an interstate compact with 3 parties. St. Louis is much smaller, but they did have 2 states, and there were dedicated sales taxes in each of those cities and counties. As we look for information on each agency, we found that even though these agencies had some form of dedicated operating revenues, and we looked them up and sort of found different news articles and things, there were examples where those dedicated sources often did increase at the same rate of expenses that those agencies had, and so it wasn't necessarily a panacea. There was conditions exist across the board. When we previewed this content with our signal staff earlier in the week, the question came up as to whether any peer agencies had anything like 3% cap that we have here. And again, that's Virginia, so 2 states on a compact kind of thing. We didn't find anything because it's just so different. The closest we could find was the MBTA and the local assessments, where the local assessments were capped at 2.5% or CPI. But in that example, that was only $179 million out of the total bucket. From our colleagues who used to work in the area who helped translate this information for us, they described it as sort of, it's more of a way to have skin in the game for the cities and the counties because of the role of the state in the MBTA. And as you can see in the figures, most of that funding is from the statewide sales tax. And so it's just a very different situation. There was some form of limited increase to that funding. So at this point, our next steps are to forward the findings to the proposed WMATA operating funding group we discussed as part of the annual report, which would start its work next year. So.
All right, Andrew, thank you very much. You guys did a great job on this. That last recommendation on the next steps, rather, that's a technical working group, right?
So we're still, yes, we are still putting together some structure on it. I would say it's mostly a technical working group, but we have had some conversations about understanding the landscape. How do we interface with the committee and the commissions, and then how that process evolves over next year. I think right now we want to be very flexible in how we approach it.
Okay. And then my only other observation and maybe a soft request. This is great work. I would note that we're unique in another way in that we're the system for the national capital. So it'd be really helpful without going too far into depth. It'd be really useful to know if London, Paris, Tokyo, maybe another national capital or two, if the national or federal government provide any support for operating the system.
Good question.
Actually, do you know? I don't know.
Toronto, I think, does.
Toronto, that's a great, that's a,
Yeah.
thank you. Mexico City.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yes, Mr. Letourneau.
Just a quick question. So are these bus and rail combined, all of these?
So it's all modes. So it's at the
It's
very
all
first,
modes,
it's their
okay.
entire budget. And on the first slide, we have the modes that are listed. You can see, so this is not by mode. This is grand total, whatever modes they have.
Okay, yeah. So, and then everything that's considered dedicated funding is essentially revenue from some sort of tax that just flows either to an umbrella agency and then to the transit agency or directly to the transit agency.
Typically, we
Right.
had to sort of use our best judgment at times. I think one thing I learned in this is the importance of budget documentation transparency, because it was a bit challenging at times to figure it out. But for the most part, yes.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Snyder.
Sure. A couple observations. The first is that with regard to this working group, if it doesn't start with the current funding system with the 3% as one of the alternatives, I'd have difficulty with that. The one approach is that Metro simply aligns its costs, available revenues, with this potential growth that's built in and the potential ridership increases. So I think the level set there. Then in terms of financial operating models, I think early on in this process, we need to review the history of funding The fact is there are dedicated funds, not for operating, but there are dedicated funds. And that phrase has a particular kind of label to it that implies, oh, everything is hand to mouth, and that's not really true. So do we need more? Potentially, yes. But so that would be a second point. A third point is I think we need to go back and review the history of successful and failed efforts to provide Metro funding. If I recall, there was a referendum or something that went down, and I think it provided for a sales tax, if I remember, which led to 5 years of no action on funding. And again, I think that history needs to be pulled up. And finally, as we begin to mature these, I think we should do some scientific public opinion surveying, because it would not be a good idea to move forward with a proposal that the public is not going to accept. And while we all need to be leaders and we all think we know our constituents, when you talk about money issues, the sense was, I thought back several decades ago that the public was ready for it. Well, it turned out the public wasn't. So I hope that a part of any effort moving forward involves some scientific public opinion surveying so that we don't propose something that's a non-starter. Because that could cost us not only the ability to get something done in the near future, but could create a medium to long-term difficulty in terms of addressing issues going forward. So I wanted to put all those things on the record. It's not that these findings are bad, but they need a frame. They kind of drive toward, without some sort of explanation, they kind of drive toward, oh yeah, we should have more dedicated funding for Metro. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. And maybe there are other sources we haven't thought of, or there may be different combinations. But I think framing is going to be critically important, because the optics of this tend to drive you in a particular direction, and I think it's premature to go there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Steiner. I know, at least in Virginia and in Fairfax County anyway, I mean, what this shows me is that the real estate tax is bearing a disproportionate burden for operating Metro. It may vary from jurisdiction to local jurisdiction a little bit too, but
everything else.
And yes, that's right. Mr. Smedberg.
So I like David's idea of maybe doing a survey or something, but I think we should really do that in coordination with others. Maybe I think it's got to be a regional effort, and everyone and their mother wants to be leading this effort. So I think you're just sort of a word of caution there, right? But I think it's something that, at least on the Virginia side, we would probably be the obvious group, but I'm not sure how.
Chair, one of the big questions, obviously, in directing staff to do this work, we were framing it under, this is a deep dive with Virginia interests to be part of a bigger conversations. So I think I want that part of it is to make sure that the interests around this table, around the greater commission, we do some deep dives on that. But I would hope that this complements and gets added to the conversations that WMATA, that DC, that are. But obviously I want to make sure that we're cautious.
And then one other thing, Andrew, the dedicated funding streams that you've highlighted here, are they capped at a certain percentage or amount, or do they have annual built-in increases, or is it all?
Oh, I think it's all over the place.
So maybe based on actual revenues received,
I think in
right?
many places it was actual revenues received. In some, and it got very confusing, there were additional state funds that were matched, or it
Sort of not having that predictability could present other challenges that.
We ran across articles to that effect when looking some of these up.
Especially for a system our size, with the complexity of our system. It's one thing if you're just running, 100 buses, but it's another thing if you're running rail and train and paratransit and everything else.
And the other thing is looking at whether it's a single revenue source and the volatility of a single revenue source. I mean, as we know, at the state level, We fought to take the transportation trust fund and make it 9 sources of revenue, so that when you one may be up, another one may be down, to have less volatility with a single revenue source.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think when one maybe change from the last time we kind of did this exercise, which was during the dedicated funding for capital discussion, is I think Metro itself wants to play a bigger role. I think Randy wants to play a bigger role in Metro having the conversation. In the past, the way Metro's kind of done this is to step aside and let the jurisdictions kind of discuss how to do this. I think Randy has a particular vision about sort of becoming less reliant on jurisdictional subsidies and state support, and becoming instead funded through some other entity, some other way that creates more of a true authority kind of versus where it has now. And so I think Metro itself is going to do work on this, and I see this effort as very much supporting that and providing feedstock for it. And I think we will kind of have to corral all the different opinions and groups and this, into.
Yeah, and it's not that Metro can't lead this.
No, but we've got to do
And be a little more active.
and figure out sort of what would actually work for Metro.
But we do have things we gotta get in shape first.
Yeah, of course.
Also, one thing, Randy and I were at a lunch today, and he's talked to the board about this. We have this funding. Kate, you were there. We have this funding, and we make Metro work with the funding that we have. Ideally, it would be a conversation in the region. Okay, here's what we want Metro to be, and then how are we going to fund it? Which any business would do, obviously, but it's not what it has historically been. Now, that's a pretty big shift in thinking and approach, but it's something that, David, calm down.
But here's the good news, though. But the good news would be if the shift ultimately is less reliance on jurisdictional subsidies, essentially it's one of the key pieces of analysis that we need in this discussion is how much of our operating budgets right now as a part of our tax rate is going towards WMATA. And then if you kind of took that number and then you looked at what that was, you backed out of that, and so now that's zeroed out, the impact to the residents' tax bills, what that is, probably goes down. And then if it's replaced with another revenue source, whether it's a fee or a tax or whatever, how does that compare? Essentially, what kind of deal is this for the taxpayer? It could be a better deal. I don't know, especially if it's spread out over a greater larger area or no greater number of people. So, that's the next level analysis that we kind of need to understand. We're not doing this right now. But
I agree with what you said.
When you're out of office, David, no.
I agree with Matt.
Here for a while.
I agree with Matt, but I don't want us to lose sight of, and this is so macro and it's hard to draw a direct link. The presence of Metro in terms of its the economic strength and economic development of the region has an impact upon the values of the individual residential properties. And it's not there's not a direct line to it, and it's hard to say what percentage of the value of the residences, but it's there. So, and just like the other point is when he says we need to figure out, Metro needs to figure out what it wants to be. We ought not to lose sight of the point made much earlier, which is of all these jurisdictions, we're the only one that is serving the nation's capital.
Well,
Not just the region, but the nation's capital. And, that only goes so far with certain members of Congress. But there's a national security component to it. There's a lot of other things that factor into that.
I would just point out, if we're looking at Canada, let's look at Ottawa, not Toronto, for any Canadians. Although there's light rail there. Um, Good discussion. Any other suggestions on that? I would just note, Mr. Letourneau, you make a good point in terms of sort of future steps, is looking at, okay, what's being paid now, what's the tax burden? And then how might that compare with alternatives?
Yeah, because it's not free for citizens now. They don't see it because it's a component of what they pay in taxes to the government already, their local government, but it's not free. So,
And I know in Fairfax County, particularly if you counted both operating and capital, it's more than several cents on the tax rate.
That would be.
Real estate tax rate.
Yeah.
More than several.
I guess the big thing for me is, having lived through failed efforts, I don't want to repeat that. I want to pursue this with immense credibility, but I also want us to be checking where the public is as we're going along, so we don't make another serious error that will postpone needed action.
And I think that you said something earlier about having a scientific survey of this. We really have to be careful about those surveys. I'm not saying that we're trying to game the outcome, but we've tried locally where we are to survey people in certain projects. Their starting point is often somewhat devoid of context and devoid of the specifics or the constraints. So you get responses that are really almost, I don't want to say they're non sequiturs, but they're not really in line with what we're trying to ascertain from their perspective. So to increase the value of the respondents' input, we need to really think through how that is. What do we really want them to tell us, and how helpful will those responses be in terms of helping us decide? Because everybody's going to want to know what the responses are, so it's all be very transparent, and then we don't want to be accused of ignoring the input that we got, but we also don't want to be in a position where we have to do what the respondents have told us when it's really not centrally relevant, or it's not really going to the core issue that we're trying to fix.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Any other comments? Mr. DeFerente, got any comments? Don't forget to shoot. All right. Anything else?
I just want to make one last, perhaps not last, but one comment here, that we do have a page and a half write-up in the draft on what for the annual report on the proposed working group, or at least sort of what are some of the problems we're trying to solve. I do want to highlight that it isn't necessarily about, it's also about looking at different policies or state laws or board policy, different things that we've identified as problems. And I think prior meetings, we've identified that the disconnect between Metrobus subsidy and Metrobus service has been an area of concern, and that's been the result of the unintended consequences and interaction of a great number of policies, including the 3% cap. We do want to make sure that that's part of a broader discussion, since these things all interact and touch each other in a variety of intended and unintended ways.
Point. Thank you. Any other discussion on this? Okay, thank you. Great staff work on this. Thank you, Renetta. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Renetta.
Do you want me to go back to where I started?
Yeah, let's go back.
Yeah.
Any news, Mr.
Yeah. So we were starting to talk about how we've been pretty transparent with the fact that we need more trains. And so just to give everybody, level set, there has to be a 3-week ramp up period from the time that we announce a date for the Silver Line to start. We have obviously all the construction ends next week. The trains come back at that point. That increases demand, and then we have crowding pressure. I was just on a train that was standing room only. I barely got on the train before the door closed. So I mean that's a real thing that's occurring out on the system right now. And so we have a need for more cars. We submitted a return to service plan that would, we think, satisfy that need and was based on the very extensive experience we've had with running 7,000 series cars. The 7,000 series cars are operating right now under two different sort of regimes. The public facing ones are on certain lines, sub-fleet of cars on 4-day inspection levels, but we also have employee trains that are being done for training purposes that are running on 7-day inspection intervals on every line with the entire fleet. We've had no issues with those trains or the other trains. So at the moment, I think we aired some of our concerns about the fact that the Safety Commission rejected the return to service plan of those cars under that regime. We think that that is very fact-based at this point. These cars have undergone a year's worth of analysis. The 7-day inspection interval is very, very conservative. We were at 90 days prior to this whole incident occurring. And so, we need to get to a solution and we need clear direction from the Safety Commission on how to get there. And so we've been public about that. That has obviously, as I expect, spurred discussion between the Safety Commission and Metro and all sorts of other interested parties. And I guess I can say I'm hopeful that that discussion and intervention, or however we want to phrase it, ultimately leads us to a plan, a way forward that allows us to get enough trains back to open Silver Line. The project itself is, we're saying we would be ready to run before Thanksgiving, based on where we are currently. So that's pretty much, I just gave a little update on 7Ks and the fact that we're hopeful that airing kind of these issues will lead us toward not just on the 7K, but a better cooperative relationship with the Safety Commission as a whole. Because it's, I don't know how many of you've noticed, there was an Inspector General report that came out yesterday about the 7K issue. It reaffirmed that there was no behavior on the part of any Metro employee that was inappropriate. Nothing was hidden. It also affirmed that during the process of discovering wheel sets that were out of variance, should have brought in the safety department at that point and did not, which we've already said. But it also had some interesting observations about the MSC relationship, specifically the lack of memorializing directives or communications and the lack of a single point of contact. So you have multiple people being contacted with things that are not in writing, and that creates a not a good atmosphere for collaboration. So, and that report's now available to the public, and you can see that. So,
Anything to add, Mr. Smith?
I mean, it's been a interesting past 7 days, to say the least, and it continues tonight.
yeah.
So, more to come.
Well, I want to commend our board members for bringing this to a head, and with the return of the 7,000 series and opening up and getting management to be transparent in the dispute that's underway. I think, at least from my perspective, it looked like there was no resolution in view without, frankly, forcing the issue. And
it was never going to end.
Right.
I guess
So,
I'm
it was
sorry.
never going to end.
At this point, at the end of the day, whoever, I mean, even if WMATA management was looking at this wrong, there was no way of changing the status quo, I think, in the previous situation.
I mean, the person leading this, and Kate, I think you can confirm that. I mean, Teresa is considered to be not the safety person in the country, one or two. I mean, she leads this effort. Matt has been around her. We've all been around. She is extremely competent, extremely intelligent, and she's by the book. I mean, I just, it's been very frustrating.
Other thoughts, comments, Mr. Snyder?
Yeah, just a quick question. I think a question out there is how about the manufacturer and were there adequate safeguards based in the contract? And they're really the third party to this, right? I mean, they made the thing
Yep.
and at least in one case, it didn't operate the way it was intended to operate. So
Yeah. So I think the answer to that question lies with the NTSB investigation on the root cause. So if there is no root cause determined, then it's hard to pin that on the manufacturer or on any particular cause, right? I mean, especially when companies view all these things through a legal lens, because that's how the world works. So I think for WMATA to be able to sort of assign some type of liability on the manufacturer for this, there would have to be clear evidence that something happened to cause it. That was their responsibility. So, where at some point the public docket will get opened from the NTSB on this investigation. And I think that will be somewhat illuminating with some of the, some of the things that are there. But I think it's safe to say, based on what Randy has said publicly, there has been no smoking gun that's come forward in any of these things. There's been tons of analysis, lots of, everything from simulator labs to, you name it, it's been tried. And there hasn't been that one thing that anybody can point to and said, this is what caused it. So from Metro's point of view, it's really, we're focused right now on, okay, well, what's this inspection interval? What's the long-term plan with inspection, which is the automated inspection system? What can we do to mitigate that risk? If we have a finding that, leads you to draw a conclusion about something that needs to be fixed or something that wasn't done correctly, then that we can act, and then we can have that conversation.
so it's still on the table. You're just waiting for more evidence.
Yeah, without, a finding, it's difficult to.
Yeah, and David, it could very well be that it's something that just happened. It may never happen again. And it just,
I think the idea is, when you inspect at a certain interval, these wheel sets don't instantly work themselves out of alignment. So even slight variances you will catch if you're inspecting frequently enough. And, for whatever reason, we had a big jump up of these occurring at one time when the system was not very well used by the public. So now it's, how can we inspect frequently enough to make sure that we're catching it if there is a change in variance?
Can you allocate the cost of those inspections to the manufacturer? Say we only have to do this because the product didn't operate the way it was supposed to. I don't know. I don't expect you to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's, again, if you had some, real evidence that it was because of something they did, then maybe. But
and there are people obviously.
We're looking at it.
yeah.
Perfect.
But
We really can't.
So we need,
Just real fast, because I feel, is there any timeline for this with NTSB? Because I feel like it's taking abnormally long.
So they did release an initial report, I guess, is that what they called it? Some initial findings. And, in there, I think the one takeaway was like, look, it wasn't anything that Metro did or didn't do. Basically, it wasn't Metro's fault. They were doing all the right things. In fact, a lot of our measurement standards and the things we engage in from a safety perspective are industry leading. And if you look at Metro overall, its safety record compared to any other system, we are right at the top across the board. So, it can get better, sure.
But we haven't heard specific timeline on. There's been some discussion that it might be, getting to the end, but we don't know.
Yeah, and they don't. I mean, the problem is, they don't really have an expertise in Railcade. I think that's a fair. I mean, their main focus is aviation and maybe heavy rail. For a system like ours, it's not their main sort of focus.
how about the timeline automated?
Yeah, I think not not especially close. I think there's so much time, energy, and effort that's gone into the return to service with manual inspection. And I mean, honestly, this is one of the macro issues with the safety commission relationship. You know, it's a very intensive relationship when you have other things that you need to do in the system that I would argue are important for safety. So, you know, I think there's been so much focus on that, number one. Number two, I think Randy's indicated that he wants to be very conservative with rolling that out with the amount of testing it undergoes, variants for weather, all those kinds of issues to make sure that it's going to work and that it's something we can rely on long term. So I think there may be a little bit of a change in approach. I think Paul Wiedefeld was talking more aggressively about deploying that. I think Randy is less aggressive about the timeline to deploy that. Not that we're not moving forward on it, but he's more focused on making sure that we're where we need to be with everything else before we kind of go to that.
Fairly onerous, the process. There's so much process involved now.
Well, the manual process.
The manual process. And, you know, the one thing that the commission says is, well, you know, look, we gave Metro the ability to run X number of cars and they can't do it. Well, the reason why we can't do it is because they're measuring every 4 days. It's just not, you know, it's just not.
Well, that and when the measuring takes a car out of service for 3 days.
Yeah.
So you basically, whatever number we have, you have to do the math on that and figure out, well, those cars are not available because they're undergoing the inspection and the quality assurance process. So
One day of 4.
basically, yeah,
So you've reduced it by 75%.
exactly.
Yes.
And one of
They
my,
say we can't even run the trains we've allowed them to run. Well, the reason why is
because with this process takes this long. And honestly, one of my concerns that I think is very valid about the safety commission is they are not transit operators. I'm not questioning expertise. I'm just making the point that from an operation standpoint, when they start giving Metro advice, it's not coming from a place of expertise. You know, for instance, one of the public pieces of advice that's been given this week is that we should pull trains from other lines to be able to run Silver. Well, from an operational standpoint, what does that do to your system? What does that do to the crowding you already have? We're not exactly running the best intervals across the system as it is. So with great respect, you know, that's not their area of expertise. That's not their mission. I was involved in creating that thing. So, you know, that's our lane. So we're telling you this is what we need from an operational standpoint. So that should be better respected.
Well, I ride Metro once or twice a week and the service is really good. So pass
Yeah,
on
it's
to
not a
all
safe- I
your,
mean, yeah.
all your folks. Let me go back to
And the
the,
thing, David, why we're just on this
Mhm.
topic, you know, the one thing I know the board is worried about, I know staff is worried about, you know, Andy mentioned it at this lunch today, you know, look, these two 3000 series cars were not meant to be working 45 years later. There's only
This level of workload.
at this level that we're running them at. And in addition to the inspection of the 7000s, you've got to have people there making sure these cars are safe. And because heaven help us if
Yeah,
we have,
it's hard to even get parts for some of these cars.
yeah, I
Years old.
you know, so and then we've got, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars of cars just sitting there. And even if they gave us the word tonight that we can bring it all back, it's still going to take weeks
Yeah.
to get, you know, it's like the trains that sit in the desert or the planes that sit in the desert. You just
Yeah.
can't
Yeah.
take off.
You don't throw them out.
You gotta
You go through a very
whole
rigorous
process of review and
process,
testing.
yeah.
could I go back to the discussion about funding in the future? So I went back and there's an article by Michael J. Lewis on November 18, 2002. On November 5, the voters soundly rejected the Northern Virginia Transportation Sales Tax referendum that would have raised $140 million annually for the region's road and transit needs.
Well, that was for the,
No.
Yeah, that was the whole,
Yeah, that-
and that was not a well.
Oh, that was,
that was
The point I'm making is I want to.
no, you're right, you're right.
Yeah. No, I knew exactly what you were.
Yeah, no, I remember, I had just
I
moved.
remember supporting it, you know.
No, I knew exactly what you were.
Yeah.
No, they were, there was, that was a very unfortunate,
Yeah,
situation.
it was not timed
Where
well. It didn't-
nobody knew where the
Yeah.
money was gonna be spent.
That was the issue. I remember that was the real
They
issue.
couldn't articulate what we were doing.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know, and I don't know that type of like statewide referendum kind of thing. I don't think that's necessarily what we're talking
Oh,
about.
I agree, but
Yeah.
all I'm saying,
But you're right, yeah,
There
it's,
was a lesson to be
yeah, absolutely. If you don't, and that goes back to, we've got to fix all these issues with Metro right now. We've got to get better service. We have to get the Silver Line open. We have to get Potomac Yards open. We have to do all these things that are right in front of us. We have to make it safer. We have to collect the fares that we should be collecting from people that aren't paying them right now. We have to do all those things before we can really credibly start asking for more money. At the same time, our budget reality is, this year, $185 million deficit, next year, over $500 million deficit. So we also have to have a way to deal with that. So,
absolutely.
and rail is mostly a fixed cost, so it's not that easy to save money with it because you're paying so much for track inspectors and all the maintenance, and all that stuff, whether you're running it frequently or not.
So can I just ask, so the manual testing takes a car,
I think he said 3 days, right?
Yeah,
He said, I think that's what he said, yeah. Yes.
and we're having to do testing every 4.
Each car, every 4 days.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah, so,
car.
20 trains we have now, which is 160 cars, still, you start to see why
Basically 40.
hard to run. Yeah. I mean, we can double check the map, but they told us these cars are going out of service for a
So,
chunk of time.
so what is the average interval between a specific car being inspected again?
I don't know.
So then the question is that too much, too little?
Well,
appropriate?
there's a standard in the MSC approval that essentially is how long a train can go from the time it was inspected to when it can be deployed again. This has come up before in other contexts. And so I think it's like 7 or 10 days, but I don't want to speculate without being sure, but something like that.
Okay.
Sorry. So just to make sure I understand the math. So car's out 3 days, it's inspected for 3 days, it's out. Comes back in, it's in for 4 days or in for 1 day and then has to be re-inspected. Do we know? It's probably in for 4 days.
I think it must be in for, I don't know how they do that math, Walter, but.
Yeah, I just,
Yeah.
I was thinking.
They're in line,
I think it's in, I think it's in until it has to be inspected again.
So it'd be 4
Yeah.
days.
So it'd be 4 days,
Yeah.
but then it's out for.
Or 3.
Yeah, now,
Almost half the time.
now keep in mind too, like, there's only so many places we do this.
Right, it's only on certain
Locations,
locations.
I think we do this. There's only so many staff. They're working these shifts. So you also have to fit in with just the sort of HR parameters of, when they're, so it's not gonna be an exact, you don't necessarily get the full 4 days out of it because of when it comes out and when it's gotta go back in and when it's,
Do
so-
we,
And if they find something that needs fit, then that backs up,
do we have enough certified inspectors?
I haven't heard that being a problem.
I haven't heard that's a problem. It's just the frequencies.
I think to that point though,
7 days.
it would be a limitation on, if we went to, if we couldn't operate the whole fleet at a 7-day interval, probably because of personnel. What we're looking for though is flexibility to be able to operate enough of the fleet that we can get enough trains. I mean, Metro said that it needs 8 additional trains to open Silver Lake, which is 160 cars. So now that's like the bare minimum. That doesn't address crowding anywhere else or any other
Yeah, you're on the
But-
green line, you're on the red line,
Yeah.
you're on parts of the blue line.
and a return to service plan that only lets us use certain cars or only on a limited number of lines really operationally causes problems. And
Okay, I mean, we could be here all night.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking, you know,
Yeah.
is the inspection, yeah,
that's why we are there all day.
are the inspection facilities, 40, are they 40 or 50 years old? Or do you need to invest in that?
Well, I mean, our hope is that this is not a long term because we want to go to the other system at some point. But
Don't even, I mean, that.
yeah, I mean, well, I mean, we were doing these inspections before. They were just doing them at 90-day intervals. So this isn't, you know, and this is not, as Paul said, we're really focused on like train sets and the wheel, but you know, the inspection list is this, you know, is huge. And they all have to, all these different parts and pieces are inspected at different intervals. You know what I mean? Some of them more frequently than others, but it's like an airplane, you know, all these different pieces have their own maintenance. So, and that these people are doing all of that, you know, on different schedules and stuff. But one of the things we have been investing in is the internal system to keep track of all of it. Is it called the maximum?
Yeah, maximum.
Yeah. So Teresa has been leading an implementation of a updated safety system, like platform that is much better equipped to keep track of the complexity of all these.
It has flagged a couple things before.
Yeah. Yeah.
Minor, but a couple things.
I mean, I've said this before. I worked 37 years in the nuclear power industry.
Yep.
We have 100 operating nuclear power plants, each plant $20 billion.
Yep.
And the inspection program, as you can imagine,
Yeah.
on a plant,
Yep.
very complicated, and documentation and recordation and.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we're getting for a facility that probably represents a replacement value of $1 trillion. That I think our inspection program is actually pretty
Well-
cost effective when you consider all those variables.
When you looked at we just did the whole performance metric stats. And when you looked at our stats, they're on time and stuff is down, but it's still like, what was it, 70% or something like that? When you consider the age of the cars we're running and how stretched we are on service, it's actually pretty good, honestly.
Well, and it's not just the age of your cars, it's the
Yeah.
age of your lines and your
Yep.
power systems and your instrumentation systems and.
Yeah.
People need to go a little easy on a lot of here.
That's our quote for the day. Thank you, Dave.
And on can I just say one thing? Sorry. Totally off left field here, but on a positive note, there was a groundbreaking the other day, Hitachi, Maryland, for the 8000 series cars. So it is a field right now. They're building it, but on a positive note, I was at a reception the other night over at Union Station, and I met our engineer and the head of rail for Hitachi worldwide. And, you know, so our engineering folks have already been over. They're already talking about all the, you know, where this is going and that's going. So all that pre-work is already being done already for the 8000 series cars. So, and there were, you know, lessons learned.
Lots of focus on wheel sets.
Yeah. But, you know, they obviously have a lot of experience worldwide. So it's, we're going to be seeing some pretty advanced autos or cars there for sure. Yeah.
Right. Any more discussion on that? Any other items anyone wants to bring to the committee?
I have one.
Mr. Geary.
This has come up a couple of times, and Randy actually replied to a tweet from a Metro user, but his children have been denied passage, and you know the kids are supposed to have passes, but they lost their passes.
Oh,
The thing is, they're kids, right? I mean,
yeah.
kids lose stuff all the time, right, Matt?
I lose.
My kids.
So I don't know. There just has to be something that we can figure out so that one, the kids don't get stranded, and two, you know, they say, "Well, I'm not going to get stranded," and they jump over, and then something happens, right?
Yeah.
All that. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's the station manager having passed to like the kids, but can't just deny the kids from going home and being stranded at night somewhere. So it seems like a small thing, but I feel like it'll bubble up. there's already issues with
Yeah,
it.
well, one of the issues, there's maybe a little bit more to that particular story, but, obviously it's unfortunate it happened, but it did, and I think they're looking into it, but the district is really having a hard time to apply for the program.
Yeah.
Really struggling to make sure that all the kids get these passes that, are allowed to have these things, and it's been a real struggle for them. I know, I think Lucinda brought it up. So they're really trying to educate the parents and do outreach to make sure that kids have these passes.
And might as well just hand them out to them right there at the stations almost,
Well, there's more to it than that.
Yeah, no, I get it, but
Schools
like-
registering it, and then also we got to make sure that the kids are actually tapping, because it's important for the district for funding and for WMATA for funding, quite honestly, the numbers.
Yeah, and not to be like really negative and cynical, but there's actually a black market for these.
Yeah.
Some of the kids get them for free and then they sell them.
So, yeah.
So like there's all this, there has to be like control on
Parents are,
who's registering it, using it. And I mean, I get your point. Like we have to make sure the kid gets home. And I should say, when it comes to the whole verification discussion, I think there's been some directives with transit police to make sure that they're appropriately lenient on certain age groups and situations. So
yeah, because they don't want the setup.
No.
The group just waiting to have someone.
yeah, but if it is like legit,
Yeah.
they're supposed to have that discretion to just make sure it's handled. It does, but yeah, we can dig into that a little bit more though.
Okay. Any other items for the committee? All right, we're not currently scheduled to have another committee meeting, but we may have one, maybe December, maybe January. We'll see.
One or the other.
All right, one or the other.
Tough that is to schedule.
But we'll let everybody know. So if there's no other business for the committee, we're adjourned as of 7:15.
All right, pretty good.
So, okay.